Hey guys, I wanted to do a final video for this Knights in the Nightmare Let's Play, in which we take a look at the greater lore behind the scenes. The game is actually a part of a series of games called Department Heaven. This series is developed by Sting Entertainment, a Japanese company, and is often localized by Atlas. Currently there are 4 games in the Department Heaven series, each with their own standalone plot, but contained within the same universe as one another. You don't need to know the overall story to understand each game's individual plot, but if you do know the overall story, you can piece things together to explain what's going on a little better. We're going to take a look at that overarching plot and see how it relates to Knights in the Nightmare. This video assumes that you're familiar with the story of Knights in the Nightmare, and also contains enormous spoilers for the other Department Heaven games. Speaking of which, let's introduce them quickly. In order of release, we have Riviera: The Promised Land, originally on the WonderSwan game console and later ported to Game Boy Advance and PSP. In the game, you travel fairly simplistic maps and encounter enemies to fight, but the game really focuses on interactions between your party members as they work their way through the story. Combat is fairly similar to typical JRPGs, but there are some interesting mechanics and limitations that you play with that make each battle unique and interesting. Overall, a very good game once it grew on me, and a bit refreshing because the tone of the game is pretty lighthearted. By the way, all these screenshots are from the PSP version. Next released was Yggdra Union, which first came out on the Game Boy Advance and then the PSP. I have to confess, Yggdra Union is the only game in this series that I haven't finished. I played through the first tutorial and I liked what I saw, but it didn't really grab me and I moved on. I expect to come back to it, but it's the type of game that I need to be in the mood for. At any rate, you select cards to build a deck, and then proceed to a map where you move your guys around and engage the enemy. At first blush, it looks kinda similar to Advance Wars, and I suppose it does have some things in common, but Yggdra Union is far more complicated. Again, these screenshots are from the PSP version. Yggdra Union is also a bit unique in that it has several spin-off games that were released in Japan only. But these spin-off games are not considered parts of the main storyline, and we won't be covering them in this video. After Yggdra Union, Knights in the Nightmare was released for the Nintendo DS and then later the PSP. Of course, we are all intimately familiar with Knights in the Nightmare, so I'll spare you. The game is also available on PSP like I mentioned, but I for one just could not get used to the controls. I've been spoiled by the DS version. Finally, the last Department Heaven game to be released is Gungnir on PSP only. Ah, Gungnir. I love this game. I'd personally rank it number 2 just below Knights in the Nightmare. This game has several glaring flaws that I'm completely willing to overlook just because I love the gameplay so much. It's an SRPG and one of the more easily accessible Department Heaven games. If you played Final Fantasy Tactics, you should be able to push through the game. As you would expect, you move your guys around on an isometric battlefield and try to beat up the other team. The game seems fairly simple at first, but when you start picking up on the unique mechanics, you realize how deep and interesting the gameplay is. Each of these games has an episode number associated with them. Riviera is called Episode 1, while Yggdra Union is Episode 2, Knights in the Nightmare is Episode 4, and finally Gungnir is Episode 9. Here we see during the opening animation for Knights in the Nightmare, it displays the episode number for a brief moment. Now that we have the episode numbers hashed out, you can go ahead and forget them, because they don't really mean dick. According to the game designers, the episode numbers are meant to represent how original or unique the game is. Although I think something might have been lost in the translation, because I don't see how Knights in the Nightmare could be between Riviera and Gungnir in originality. So forget the episode numbers, they absolutely do not indicate the chronological order of the games in the overarching story. On that note, the release order of the games does not reflect their place in the overarching story either. If we arrange the games in order as they happen in the overall story, it looks more like this, with Yggdra Union being the first one chronologically, Knights in the Nightmare second, and finally Riviera as the game that occurs last in the overarching story. Now, why is Gungnir off on its own? It's because, to be honest, I don't really know where it fits in the overarching story. I've seen people online state that it's actually the first chronologically. I've seen people say it occurs between Yggdra Union and Knights in the Nightmare, but I've never seen a reason given for either of these places in the timeline. Regardless, I'm of the mind that it ultimately doesn't matter very much, as there isn't a lot of the overall story represented in Gungnir. There are some cool references to it, but in the end, Gungnir doesn't really advance the plot. So fuck it, I'll just put it off to the side. The one game that easily handles the overarching plot the most is Riviera. In fact, the plot of the game is quite significant to the overarching plot and reveals quite a lot about the universe these games are set in. Did I mention there's going to be a lot of spoilers in the games in this series? Well, that's especially true for Riviera, out of necessity. You've been warned. However, Riviera doesn't tell us the whole story, and indeed doesn't fully explain the setting. A lot of the details were kept from players until the release of Knights in the Nightmare. At that time, Sting Entertainment also released an art book called Department Heaven Episodes World Guidance, shown here. Check out that cover. That's a picture of Maria with the Ancardia, while her Marietta form is in the background. That's a badass picture, it's just awesome. This book contains original artwork for all the games released thus far, which at this point were Riviera, Yggdra Union, and Knights of the Nightmare. In addition, it supplied players with a lot of information about the Department Heaven universe, and filled in a lot of gaps that players would otherwise have no idea about. Basically, it contains information about the series that you would never pick up just by playing the games alone. Outside research is necessary if you want to completely understand what's going on. Unfortunately, the Department Heaven Episodes World Guidance was not released in the US. Instead, we got a heavily truncated version called the Tome of Lost Souls, which removed most, if not all, of the overarching story stuff, and only covered story elements for Knights in the Nightmare. This book was available as a pre-order bonus for Knights in the Nightmare, and if you watch the Let's Play, you'll know that I'd often read from it to help describe what was happening in the game. It's an awesome art book, and I picked my used copy up from Amazon for pretty cheap, so if you're interested in this stuff, I definitely recommend looking into it. But the problem is, again, the Tome of Lost Souls only covers Knights in the Nightmare stuff. Outside of Japan, we never got the Department Heaven Episodes World Guidance, so we didn't get the whole overarching story. This leads to some issues. Now, I actually have recently acquired a copy of the Department Heaven Episodes World Guidance. I did so knowing that the text is in Japanese and I sure as hell can't read it. But it turns out I'm a big enough fucking nerd that I wanted the book anyway. It's very, very cool and there's a lot of neat artwork inside it. But it was also advertised as a hardcover. Mine's softcover, that's fucking bullshit. Anyway, the important thing is I don't read or speak Japanese. Funny thing when I leaf through it though. So I just sort of flipped through the pages, catching what little English there was and not really understanding what I was looking at. Eventually I found myself in the Riviera section and found a couple pages that looked interesting. Let's see, yep, that's the Riviera title, logo, and that's the artwork from Riviera. I'm definitely in the Riviera section. So what do we have here, huh? It kind of looks like a timeline. Oh, that's neat. I don't recall Riviera's plot being very confusing or anything, but there are some important things that happen before the game starts, and some details might get lost on the player as he or she plays through the game. So pretty cool they added that. I didn't think much of it and then continued flipping through the book until I found myself in the Yggdra Union section, and what do I find? But another timeline. I haven't played this game, so I don't know how complicated the plot is, but regardless, it's a neat thing to see. I imagine it helped clarify the chain of events for some players. You know, it's pretty cool that they've done timelines for these two games. Wait a minute. There's a Knights in the Nightmare timeline. There's a Knights in the Nightmare timeline. A fucking timeline. If you watched my Let's Play, you suffered through me trying to figure out the order in which the flashback cutscenes went. Remember when I was like, maybe it happened this way, or maybe this way, I don't know. Well, guess what? There's an official published timeline. Fuck. Well, I can't read it anyway. And some things aren't clear. It looks like chronologically, Scene 40 is the flashback that happened first. But there's no way that's right. Scene 40's flashback was when some Tiamats were told of Cape Horn's exile. But that conversation can't be the first thing that happened chronologically. Remember, we actually saw the flashback when Cape Horn was exiled, and that was Scene 39's flashback. Furthermore, Scene 40 shows up twice on this timeline. Finally, we're missing some scenes altogether. So as usual, I don't know what the hell is going on. Alright, you know what, whatever, let's move on. Unfortunately, I need to talk boringly about a disclaimer. The Department Heaven World Guidance book is pretty integral for understanding the story, and as I've painfully demonstrated, I'm clueless with the reading of Japanese. This means I am 100% reliant on fan translations of the book from the internet. Turns out, this was a pretty contested topic back in the day when the World Guidance book was first released. There were arguments online as English-speaking posters discussed what was said in the book. As is true with anything, there were some fans that were extremely invested in the series at this point, and got upset when plot points were translated from the World Guidance book that conflicted with what people already knew or thought they already knew. It got to the point where you can find people online calling each other fucking liars. Okay, let's all just take a step back. There were some minor contradictions with what was already established. However, the game designers themselves don't seem to take this very seriously. Game designer Shinichi Ito and marketing guy Tomita Yoshihisa even mentioned in an interview they hadn't actually planned on these games becoming a series until they started working on the marketing for Knights of the Nightmare, which was the third game to be released. At that time, they decided how to tie all the games together and release the World Guidance book to help flesh out the background information. In the interview, they acknowledged that everything won't necessarily fit together perfectly. There are some retcons and some new ideas introduced. This makes it tough for someone who doesn't speak the language and has to rely on the translations of others. Knowing that some of the translations were criticized for being inaccurate, I did what I thought was the best method I could use. I looked for multiple sources and searched for corroboration between them. In some cases, it was stuff from an internet forum. In one case, it was from a fan's Livejournal. I have links in the description to the main sources I used for this video, and tried to use the information that was supported by multiple sources. Eventually, after enough things lined up, I'd trust the sources enough that in the case that one might have some information that the others didn't, I'd go ahead and use it as long as it sounded like it fit with the rest of the story. This was the best method I could come up with, and of course, there's a level of trust that I need to have with the sources. Having said all that, I want to give a huge thanks to my three main sources, and if I get something wrong, that's on me. Okay, finally, after having said all that, let's get started. Let's discuss the Department Heaven setting and the universe that all the games take place in. To begin, all games share a common Asgard, the realm of the gods. Here is an image I got from Google image search for a heavenly city, I think. Anyway, Asgard is ruled by order. It was founded by the gods, who were once a single being but then split into several independent gods. Asgard is described as a sterile, orderly place, the extreme of a lawfully ruled place. There are citizens that live there. We see members of the Asgard army during Yggdra Union. Now, since there is a citizenry made up of individuals with their own inner thoughts and feelings, you could say that Asgard's not perfectly orderly. There is a degree of chaos. Opposite Asgard is the underworld. This image is from Riviera, where you have the chance to actually go to the underworld in an optional side mission. Anyway, demons and wild monsters live in the underworld. It is a place of expanding chaos. However, it's important to point out that the strongest monsters gain control of the weaker, and thus it's not a completely chaotic environment. The strongest monsters make something of a ruling class, though there is constant fighting and challenging for power. Eventually, Zolganark emerged as the strongest of all and the king demon. Asgard and the underworld are in a constant struggle for territory. The underworld represents expanding chaos while Asgard struggles to contain it and preserve order. They fight over control of what are called surface worlds. Each game of the series has taken place on a different surface world. Here I put the game's box art between Asgard and the underworld to represent surface worlds, and I just add some planets just for more surface worlds. Now I need to clarify something I just said. Even though I mentioned that both Asgard and the underworld are fighting for control of the surface worlds, that's not entirely true. While the underworld strives to claim surface worlds and expand its range, Asgard wishes to maintain a balance but does not necessarily seek control of the surface worlds. Asgard prefers a hands-off, laissez-faire approach. However, they cannot allow the underworld to claim surface worlds and expand territory. Both Asgard and the underworld have access to these surface worlds. Asgard itself is linked to a realm known as Heaven's Gate, which is in turn connected to the surface worlds. Here's a couple shots of Heaven's Gate as depicted in the game Riviera. During part of the game, you travel through the Heaven's Gate to reach the land known as Riviera. There's a theme of chained lattices and scales throughout. At any rate, Heaven's Gate allows Asgard access to any of the surface worlds and affords them intervention when necessary. The Heaven's Gate itself is guarded by angels, which are powerful entities who were created by the gods as servants. Angels are 100% devout to the gods and were created as sort of blank slates with little to no emotion or self-awareness. But outside stimuli can cause them to develop emotions. One well-known angel is Marietta, pictured here as she appeared in Yggdra Union. She looked a little different in Knights in the Nightmare. Here's her official artwork. Lots of detail, kind of hard to take it all in. Let's switch back to the Yggdra Union version. At any rate, as I mentioned, Marietta's job is to patrol Heaven's Gate and guard it. Since Heaven's Gate allows access to Asgard, it's a potential route for invading forces, so you have to be vigilant. Just as Asgard has Heaven's Gate, the Underworld has Hades' Gate. Pictured here is a screenshot from Gungnir, where you briefly get a glimpse of Hades' Gate during a cutscene. So what we have here is, instead of a direct route from Asgard or the Underworld to the surface worlds, there's an intermediate region, either Heaven's Gate or Hades' Gate, and from the gate you can get to the surface worlds. However, contrary to the image on screen right now, while Hades' Gate has the ability to link to these surface worlds, it doesn't have a standing connection with any, which is unlike Heaven's Gate. What this means is, in order to invade a surface world, a Hades' Gate must be constructed and then opened, for lack of a better term, which is very difficult for the demons and monsters of the Underworld to do. So in the natural state, Asgard has access to the surface worlds, but suppresses the Underworld's access as well as it can. Okay, now that we've set the stage, let's get to the actual plot. First off, there's another correction to be made in this image. Originally, the surface world known as Riviera was a territory of the Underworld. Now, as described, the Underworld acts as expanding chaos, and the creatures there are driven by a desire to spread and conquer. 1,000 years before the events of any of the games, Zul'Gurnik began a campaign to conquer the surface worlds and eventually Asgard. This became known as the War Ragnarok. Initially, the Underworld's advances were poorly organized and met with defeat, but as time passed, the attacks became more focused and more devastating. Territories fluctuated constantly. As the link to Heaven's Gate was destroyed on a surface world, then that surface world would be abandoned to the Underworld, and likewise with the Hades Gates. In addition, reconstruction of the gates would allow each faction to reclaim lost territories. The surface worlds were constantly captured by each side over and over. Eventually, the Underworld began gaining ground on Asgard, to the point where invasion of the gods' realm was imminent. Faced with inevitable invasion and defeat, the gods made a desperate choice. They broke the ancient taboo and created a new life form called the Grim Angels. These creatures were made exclusively for combat and possess immense strength. They are basically living weapons, yet wielding special weapons themselves called diviners. In order to wield these holy weapons, a Grim Angel must sacrifice a part of themselves. For example, Ein, the main protagonist in the game Riviera, is the Grim Angel pictured on the left here. He had to sacrifice his wings for his diviner, Einherjar, while Lada, the Grim Angel on the right, sacrificed his emotions so that he may brandish his diviner, Lorelei. It's not specified how many Grim Angels were created. All were quickly deployed to defend Asgard from the invasion. During the War of Ragnarok, the Grim Angels and their immense strength were barely enough to win the war for Asgard. Although it was a close victory, it was also a decisive one, and the Underworld forces were pushed out of the surface worlds. Asgard was able to re-establish all of its gates, and one of the victory conditions was that Asgard was able to enforce that the land of Riviera was annexed. Following the war, most of the Grim Angels were placed in a type of stasis. One of the problems with them is that they have a short lifespan compared to normal angels. For that reason, they are put in a sort of sleep mode to be reawakened when needed. I mentioned earlier, but the gods broke a taboo by making the Grim Angels. Well, what does that mean? They're gods. Surely they can do whatever they want, right? The problem is that, in making them, the gods infused the Grim Angels with some of their own divine power, giving the Grim Angels their fearsome strength. This process was fatal to the gods. Shortly after Ragnarok was won, the gods sealed the remainder of their power in the newly liberated land of Riviera, and then disappeared. The Ragnarok War was won, and the Underworld was beaten back with a truce, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Now Asgard was faced with an even worse dilemma. The gods were dead. In their place, a council of 7 magi assumed the job of acting as stand-ins for the gods. The magi do not possess the gods' power, but they can wield magic. They are given magic cloaks that prolong their lives, so that they might live forever. The magi convene and make decisions on behalf of Asgard, and appear as a unified body of members. However, internally, each of the magi are fighting for power over one another, with open-faced lying and political undermining happening non-stop. There is an unstable balance. Among the 7 magi, only one is known as a character, Hector. Hector is perhaps the most crafty and ambitious magi, and also possibly the most intelligent. He appears as the main antagonist in the game Riviera, where his schemes come to light and are defeated. Hector makes a very brief cameo in Knights in the Nightmare and is mentioned in Yggdra Union as well. So the state of Asgard is looking pretty bad. 1,000 years ago, they won the War of Ragnarok, but lost their gods in exchange for the Grim Angels. The Magi are making decisions on behalf of the gods, but bicker and argue behind the scenes. Should another Ragnarok occur, it is unlikely that Asgard would survive. So that's the overarching plot in a nutshell. As mentioned, we can apply some of this overarching plot to each of the games once we're aware of it. Here's an example. Marietta, one of the Guardian Angels, makes a clear transition through the games, which allows you to put them in a timeline. During Yggdra Union, the royal army you play as advances on Asgard and meets Marietta as she is in her position guarding the Heaven's Gate. In the official canon, she talks them down and they turn around. So at this time, Marietta is stationed in Heaven's Gate. Next, in Knights in the Nightmare, we see Marietta's downfall. She is sent down on a mission to destroy the Westkin Tower, which they had erected in order to get the attention of the gods and allow them to plead for help. This tower offended the gods, and as a result she was sent down. However, we know that the gods were actually gone by this point, so that she must have been sent by the Magi. Once she completed her mission, she ponders why the tower was built in the first place, and decides that if she was stronger, she could have prevented the tower from being built. I don't really get the logic, but whatever. As a result, she makes a pact with Zolganark, who orchestrated Ragnarok in the first place. Whoops. Of course, that resulted in the birth of Maria and Melissa, both of whom we meet in the game. This certainly caused problems, but really, the plot of the game was started with the ancient arbitrator. As a reminder, the arbitrator is an enormously powerful entity stationed on the surface world. Here Yelma talks about the legendary power of the arbitrator, and describes it as a force that can best any holy or unholy power. In essence, the arbitrator is a being tasked with maintaining neutrality between the underworld and Asgard. However, an ancient arbitrator of Glevnir ran into a problem. As described by Maria, this arbitrator took pity on the oppressed Tiamats and actually transcribed what was called the Unwritten Law, which was forbidden knowledge that only the arbitrator was supposed to know. The exact content of this unwritten law is not very well understood or defined, but suffice it to say it was only meant for the arbitrator. The act of writing this forbidden knowledge down and giving it to the Tiamats was a sin in the gods' eyes, and in order to punish this arbitrator, his knowledge was sealed. Suddenly, he no longer remembered the fact that he was the arbitrator, and therefore he did not know the role he was meant to play. During a flashback, Marietta ruminates a little on the role of the arbitrator, but she thinks of it in terms of being the duty to remove those who attempt to circumvent the pact the world's made. Basically, those who go against the rule. We're also given some information during a couple times when the omniscient narrator got onto the subject. Here, it's stated that the barriers between Asgard, the underworld, and the world of Glevnir were weakening due to the hijinks of some troublemakers. And later it's stated that the force that should have controlled those troublemakers had disappeared. I think we have enough information here. Without the arbitrator doing his job, the world began to fall into decay and the barriers between realms weakened. We're not given a concrete time when the ancient arbitrator's knowledge was sealed, so we can't say if it was a decision made by the gods or the Magi, but considering what a poorly thought out decision it was, I'm inclined to think it was the Magi. So at this point, the unwritten law was physically written down. We call this copy of the Forbidden Law the Written Law. In addition to punishing the arbitrator, another bonehead decision was to allow the written law to exist. It remained in the Tiamat's possession for years and years until Cape Horn found it. With the written law in his possession, Cape Horn was able to recruit Yelma, who in turn summoned Zolganark. Shortly after this, the events of the game began, and throughout the game, we learn that King Wilmgard is the arbitrator. So in the grand scheme of things, we see in this game how a surface world might fend off an attack from the underworld without Asgard intervention, thanks to the arbitrator. This falls in line with Asgard's MO of hands-off governing. Now, I said the underworld was defeated without Asgard intervention, though Maria was clearly instrumental in it. Well, that wasn't a result of Asgard reacting to the problem. It was a lucky coincidence that she got wrapped up in everything. At any rate, at the end of the game, we kick the shit out of Zolganark, then Malad Margus. Since we obtained the Holy Staff and Cardia over the course of the game, Maria and Melissa are reunited as Marietta, who flies off, predicting that she will be severely punished. Her crime, making a pact with Zolganark and giving him a servant in the form of Melissa. While it was a really dumb decision to make a pact with someone, at least she fixed it. The next game in the timeline is Riviera, the most recent game timeline-wise. We know this because one of the bosses in that game is called Archangel, and in fact is the fallen Marietta. So from this we can conclude that, indeed, Marietta was not forgiven for her mistake and she was not allowed back in Asgard. In interviews with game developers, it's stated that she made a pact with a powerful demon and became one of the accursed. This demon is not named, but we can probably assume it was Zanar, who actually survived his fight with the arbitrator. As mentioned, you actually fight her in Riviera. Since she's an angel, she shouldn't be able to die, so I do think it's likely she survived. So, over the course of the games, we see Marietta's arc as first a loyal Asgard servant, standing guard at Heaven's Gate, to making a dumb but innocent mistake, to finally not being forgiven and siding with the underworld. A tragic story indeed, but it has provided us with a chronological order to the games. We have more examples of the connections between games. Consider Zanar, the king of the underworld. He spends nights in the nightmare lurking in the shadows of the King's Hall, where he was summoned. He's trapped within a magical barrier, and his motive in the game is to break free and take the world as a territory for the underworld. Remember, he was the mastermind behind the War of Ragnarok, and he damn near took out Asgard. In Nights in the Nightmare, we have a climactic battle and defeat him, and then his second form. So he is thoroughly fucked up, but like I said, he survived. He appears in Riviera in a skeleton form as a bonus hidden boss, with the idea being that even though the arbitrator of Glevnir fucked him up, he survived and still held enough power that he posed a threat as a tough boss. The game creators openly state that this is a retcon, but I think they'd worked it in fairly well. The fact that he's a skeleton in Riviera loans itself to an explanation for Mlad Margus's appearance. Remember, Mlad Margus was the final boss of Nights in the Nightmare, and was the result of Melissa fusing with Zanar after he'd been defeated. You can make out the monster's skull and ribcage in her sprite, and in the official artwork it just plain looks like she drapes his corpse over her shoulders. I thought it was a nice touch and a decent way for the game developers to link the two games after the fact. So far we've covered Marietta's journey through the series as well as Zanar's. We have one more to consider. Remember Hector, one of the 7 magi who were acting in lieu of the gods? Behind the scenes, he's the one trying to take over everything, and it's made clear he's a real dickhead. Let's follow his story chronologically in the series. Since Yggdra Union is the first game chronologically, we'll start there. Hector doesn't make an appearance, but he is mentioned by one of the characters. Remember how Marietta is stationed at Heaven's Gate at the time, and Yggdra's royal army confronts her? The conflict here is that Yggdra is pissed off at Asgard for the fuck-ups they committed, which gave rise to the events of the game. However, Marietta is guarding the access route to Asgard, which is her job. So, regardless of if it's a human army or an invading demon army, she needs to prevent access to Asgard. When this happens in the game, Marietta tells Yggdra to hand over her sword and get the hell out. The player has the option of complying or telling Maria, "No, fuck you, we're coming for the gods." That choice results in a battle between the royal army and Marietta, which I understand is a tough fight. In the event that the player manages to beat Marietta, they are advanced to a new battlefield, which is actually an area of Heaven's Gate. The design is similar to the other time we saw Heaven's Gate, in Riviera, with the floating islands chained together. And remember, Heaven's Gate is right next door to Asgard. This scenario is not considered canon, but we can still get useful plot elements out of it. Even though in the official story these things didn't happen, we can still assume that the things that occur are accurate and would have happened if Marietta really did fall in battle. As long as the characters are written consistently, we can still learn about them by their reactions to these scenarios, and we can become privy to more of what's going on in the grand scheme. At any rate, beating Marietta leads to a final stage in Heaven's Gate. One of the boss fights in this area is with a Grim Angel wielding a diviner. So another tough battle plays out, and once this Grim Angel loses, she says, "I wasn't able to win, shit, I need to tell Hector." It turns out that this enemy was actually an artificial Grim Angel that Hector had created, complete with an artificial diviner. If we completely ignore the ethics of this, Hector is actually pretty smart in doing this. At this point, the gods are dead, and there's no way to make new Grim Angels. Trying to find a way to create them artificially is, tactically, a wise thing to do, and Hector's being proactive instead of just hoping really hard that the underworld doesn't try to pull another Ragnarok. Ethically, there are obviously some issues, but Hector doesn't give a fuck about that. Moving on to the next chronological game, we see that Hector doesn't appear in the red path of Nights in the Nightmare. But he does make a cameo in the blue path, which is a non-canon version of the story. I haven't played the Blue Path, but fortunately I was able to find Hector's scene on YouTube. These shots are from the PSP version of the game. There he is in his private quarters or something. He starts talking to himself and says that the world below is in turmoil, and that must be why the gate has become unstable. Remember, if the connection between this world and Heaven's Gate is severed, then the land is effectively lost to the underworld. Hector wonders if there's been a strain on the barriers of the world, so obviously he's not aware of what's been going on below, or the backstory of Glevnir and the ancient arbitrator. He finally concludes with, maybe I should look into that. Well yeah, maybe you should. This cutscene happens right before Yelma confronts Zolganark with the arbitrator's body, so really late in the game. Yeah, Hector, maybe you should fucking look into it. Jesus. Anyway, that's his role in Knights in the Nightmare. Moving on to the next game in the series, Riviera. Hector plays a pretty prominent role in this game, and his master plan is part of the plot. Here we see him early in the game, issuing orders to the Grim Angels Ein and Lada. Hector is a total asshole in these conversations, saying things like, "If we have to sacrifice all the living people of the land of Riviera, too fucking bad." He even dismisses concern for the lives of the Grim Angels. When Ein goes missing, Hector doesn't give a shit and tells Lada to hurry up and complete the mission. As the game progresses, Ein comes to realize he doesn't agree with Hector and refuses to obey him. Of course, this makes Hector an enemy to contend with, as well as Lada, who is still taking orders from Hector. I think I should quickly explain the plot here. At this time, the gods are dead, and Asgard is afraid of another invasion. Just before their death, the gods hid the last of their power in the land of Riviera. Hector states that he wants the Grim Angels Ein and Lada to find this power and use it to actuate the retribution, which is ultimately a pretty vague description, but we do know that it will likely destroy Riviera. The game progresses, the main protagonist being Ein. Over the course of the game, Ein meets new friends, has adventures, and decides to find a way to keep Riviera alive. He also crosses swords with Lada, and eventually Hector as well. After his defeat, Hector reveals his true plan, to awaken an entity called Seth and merge with her to become a god himself. I'm skipping over the final details of this plot, but the main point is another boss fight. Winning this fight ends the game and presumably kills Hector. So Hector's arc over the storyline shows us that he's been doing weird experiments and trying to make Grim Angels, but his endgame is to grab power and rule Asgard. All of his scheming comes to an end in Riviera. I'd love to see a game set after Riviera that shows the fallout of Hector's death. And that brings us to the end of the timeline. Once again, I didn't cover Gungnir, because aside from some cool references, there isn't a whole lot in that game which advances the overall story. There's no Marietta, Zolganark, or Hector to my knowledge. There are a few passing mentions of Asgard, and one of the main characters calls herself a Grim, but that's about it. We do learn a little bit about Hades' gates. It's revealed that the demon spear Gungnir is actually the key to the Hades gate of that world, but that's really the extent of it. Okay guys, that's the gist of the Department Heaven series in a nutshell. I glossed over a lot of things in order to keep this video at a reasonable length, and of course, this video is my interpretation of the data and translations I found. At this time, there is no known follow-up to the Department Heaven series. The original intent was to make a total of 9 games, but after Gungnir was released in 2011, there hasn't been any indication from Sting that a new Department Heaven game is in the works. Obviously that really sucks. I'd love to see what else they have in mind. For example, remember how the 7 Magi are a bunch of conniving, backstabbing assholes? Game designer Shinichi Ito mentioned once that he'd like to do a game concerning them. There would be no combat. Instead, the player would try to manipulate the other Magi behind the scenes and try to undermine them while gaining power for yourself. Now how fucking awesome would that be? Maybe someday. Anyway, there you have it. I need to thank my sources for this video. First and foremost, of course, are the translations for the World Guidance book. And again, I put links down below for each of the main ones I used. In addition, I need to thank the fan site Lacrima Castle, which was an enormous resource for the images I use in this video. Really, it's the definitive Department Heaven fan site, and if the games interest you, definitely visit. I also need to thank a couple Let's Players who covered some of the games in this video, for additional information and a lot of the images that I just flat out fucking stole. There's a fantastic Let's Play of Yggdra Union done by Orcs and Ostriches, really informational. I'll most likely use it as a guide when I pick up Yggdra Union again, and it's written in a way that explains the game mechanics as well as describing the plot and filling in the backstory when necessary. Another Let's Play that I stole from is the Riviera Let's Play done by Didja. This Let's Play is absolutely hysterical. Mr. Redo has added his own narrative to the game while keeping the main plot intact. A lot of times that's a recipe for disaster as the author goes down a fan-fiction-y path, but in this case it's a complete success and definitely worth reading for some good laughs. Check below for links to both of these superior Let's Plays. Finally, there was a lot of images that I just got from Google Image Search. I guess the only thing left to mention is the music from this video. All music was taken from various games in this series. And I guess that's that. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. This is such a cool little series that not a lot of people seem to know about, and I really hope it does continue on in some form. At any rate, I'll see you again.